Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Thanks also to those who are joining us online. As always, this event is live streamed and it will be archived afterwards on our page on Paula Cooper Gallery's website, PCG Studio, so you will be able to see it later if you wish or share it. So spring is here finally. Actually, I wrote this I wrote this Saturday, and I feel like it's already gone, and it's the summer already. But and Vincent Katz has brought us some daffodils, and in the form of his newest poetry collection. I believe it's your 15th, give or take. Vincent is a poet, translator, editor, and critic, as well as a curator who organized the first museum retrospective of the work of Rudy Burkhardt at IVAM in Valencia, Spain, as well as an exhibition and a catalog about the famed Black Mountain College, also in Spain, at the Reina Sofia Center for Contemporary Art in Madrid. Hello. He has collaborated with a number of other poets and artists, including Adam Waldman and Francesco Clemente. Daffodil, as I just said, couldn't be better timed. Daffodils are everywhere right now in our tree pits and suburban gardens. Fun fact about daffodils, the daffodil is a non-native plant. It's actually native to Europe, especially Southern Europe and the Mediterranean. Some say the Pilgrims brought it to America so they wouldn't miss the gardens they left behind. Like all perennials, the daffodil marks cyclical time. It comes back every year, but it also reminds us of linear time as it disappears with the end of spring. Those right outside the bookstore are already looking a little the worse for wear, in fact. These two temporalities, cyclical and linear, are central to Vincent's book. During the Great Depression, the daffodil was known as the poor man's rose, and a whole daffodil industry blossomed. It's hardy, familiar, and one might even say common. There's a similar humility in Katz's poetry. A quintessential New York poet, thinks James Schuyler, for example. He walks us through the city, past tenements and fire escapes, into parks, the occasional museum, and yes, near rows of daffodils. And life unfolds in a minor key under his empathetic eye. Not just his eye, his attentive ear too. Music runs through these poems, Ravel, Nels Cline, Coldplay, and more. A nod perhaps to the trumpet shape of the daffodil. But like Schuyler, Katz's quiet, loving attention to the everyday often opens up onto deeper questions about love, loss, and the passage of time. And though this book is firmly rooted in New York, it also carries us briefly across space and history, first to Rome, then to Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, the site of the early Christian church councils, and finally to the Acropolis, where, quote, the old flowers wait for us, end quote. Which brings us to two more points of trivia about the daffodil. First, the word daffodil comes from the Latin aphrodilus, which traces back to the Greek asphodelus. Asphodels were said to grow along the banks of the river Styx in Hades. They are the flowers of the afterlife, symbols of mourning and memory, emblems of layered time, where the present and the remembered past converge, just as they do in daffodil. Second, the daffodil's botanical name is Narcissus, pseudo-Narcissus. It's the flower, of course, that bloomed where Narcissus died after spurning all who loved him, including the nymph Echo. A story long associated with poetry itself, a turning inward, a longing, an echo of the unattainable. And here it's worth noting that Vincent Katz received the 2005 National Translation Award for his translation of the complete elegies of the Latin poet Propertius. He's currently at work on new translations of Works and Days and the Theogony by Hesiod. I don't mean to suggest that all of the poems in Daffodil are brimming with mythological significance disguised beneath a veneer of contemporaneity. That would be tedious. Only that with the right frame of mind and the right music, a simple New York stroll can become a portal through historical, emotional, and spiritual time. To help us explore these questions further, we're joined tonight by Edmund Berrigan, author of the poetry collection More Gone, Gladstone Children, and Disarming Matter, as well as the memoir Can It? Together with Anselm Berrigan and Alice Notley, he is co-editor of the Collected Poems of Ted Berrigan, the Selected Poems of Ted Berrigan, and with Nick Sturm, Get the Money, Collected Prose 1961-1983 by Ted Berrigan. So please join me in welcoming Vincent Katz and Edmund Berrigan. Thank you. And we'll have a conversation, and then we will open the floor to questions after the conversation. So.
Wow, what an amazing introduction. Thank you, Anthony. I learned a lot. So, well, yeah, I love this bookshop. Thank you, Paula. It has a good omen feeling about it. As Willem de Kooning said about Frank O'Hara. And yeah, I've been here a couple of times before. Once was with Robert Creeley when our Black Mountain College book came out. We did an event here. Another time with my dear friend Ann Waldman for our collaborative book, Fantastic Caryatids. So it's great to see you all. Thank you for coming. So I'll read, we'll chat, and then maybe you'll want to join the conversation. So these poems were all written between 2020 and 2023. And in a way, they follow on my previous book, which is called Broadway for Paul, which was written, those poems were written in the aftermath of the first Trump election. And I took this approach of kind of trying to remove all the artifice I could from my poetry and my life. These poems were, so they continue somewhat in that mode. There's a certain openness to them, but then there was also the pandemic. So there's some animal poems and, yeah, city and country, basically. Daffodil. If I imagine all time sequestered in the fold of a daffodil, close to the desire of sitting next to someone, it's like a trip uptown and then one downtown, and my door is open to the revenge of snow. Clasp me as a trumpet seeks release. I should see daydreams in eyes, all aflutter and simplified down, the stores and all the other places we settle down to. How's the sound? You can hear me okay? Bryant Park Ode. The skating rink is down. They're going to figure out how to grow grass again. A crane lurks on hidden high-rise, grace to be born and live as variously as possible. She's an amazing intelligence. I'm lucky to have her in my life for a time. Everything is for a time. Photographing statues in the rain. Give us this day our daily ornate bronze Romanesque lamppost. Ram's head garland, leafy fountain. Can you hear the fountain? Odd hump where grass goes. On hearing the Strokes outside Commons, for Isaac and Oliver, who are here. Thank you for coming. Music coming down again, a simple refrain, a little mournful, but then that is the tenor ultimately. And if it's reminiscent of other music, that too is a human trait. At the end, we all just sit with what we've got. For John, people create lives. Families occur as lives grow, together and with separation. Drums in the park at night, and another music people congregate to. The music's mix and the people walking across in the dark. Rhythm comes out of the dark, bonding people, blending them. Back in the streets, people are walking. There's a slowdown. Is there no mystery, or is there something different from what appears? A tendency toward life that is not darkness. This is a slightly longer one. The highway. Along behind the houses, it comes nearer. Vast tract of sound, admitting, exonerating, a flood with vowel reach, internal stretch to other unknown. While the path veers, a group convenes, even one of a number. Studies are ways of communal thought. But the sound out by the path, where the abandoned car lurks in the woods, is pristine. It hurtles among fistfuls, garlanded, seeming a lost irony in the bushes. There's a light and a flow, prints in newly present mud, but still the drawings of twigs beneath ice. There's low light on an oak leaf, tan and drying out on the ground. The ice keeps the air cool. A huge sideways chunk of what was once a tree, still projecting life and mission into air. A mission. That could be to be in touch. A better understanding of the peoples of the earth, FDR. And Roland Hayes sang Berlioz. A talk around a table, an asking, followed by an offering. In the offing, deference. A show to present. One no longer only one. How had that happened? St. Arnaud, Christchurch, Twizzle, moving south, and a gathering near the fire. Talk of aspirations, projects, sillinesses, all a shared gold, and in some, ambition to know that one and one should coalesce by times to more than can be fit into magazines and books. The snow is dark, still light in latest light. Windows lit across our human endeavor. They release a pattern to cold. Then the snow is more visible instead of less. A wind is heard, bolsters senses of night. The light on all those trees. A display of brown hanging oak leaves, the hard snow, water beneath cracking ice. All in all, a reasonable supposition. But to care, to converse, to research a situation, times have changed dramatically, but not only for the worse. There's common interest and support. There's learning in long days and cold nights. The light visible from these windows provides the content for this day's breathing. You wonder if anyone will read anything. You think of those gone who won't. Someone gets out of a car into the cold, icy snow piles and streaks where it melted. A bird bath, 2 cars, a truck, and a white van parked. The large house opposite holding temporary lives. Works less temporary, perhaps. Sounds of living coming and going. The truck and van have left. Does anyone think it worthwhile to worry about words, lines, and commas? Someone does, and could. Even one who knows a greater thing perpetuates itself by gaining an understanding in time. In the snow that keeps falling, spreading gently over ground, in the cold that goes up the tall pines at night, we form a number, albeit shifting, albeit some more than others. Networks are superficial, break down. Friends help you down the road. The help might only be a word, but it's enough to see the light of day. Thank you. The rabbit for Elaine. Seen her or him or them hopping around lately, the hope in fear and thrill to run, ear fine-tuned to danger and excitement. She or he or they skip up steps, run lightning quick across grass to cover. And this one's a New York nature poem. The water bug. It is enormous, threatening. There's a desire to kill it and a desire not to. But allowing it to go free on the roof is also perilous. They move quickly, they fly. They are very aware of being hunted. Capturing it in a cup, how much does the cup need to be cleaned? We think of water bugs as, by definition, filthy. But how much of the water bug is actually dirty? Do we really know? A New York song. A New York night, slightly melancholy, an air of horns. Two young women walk in skirts and tops, everything light. A quietness even in people dining outdoors at restaurants. The next day, fresh breeze, music coming through from somewhere. You sit at your local cafe outdoors and drink coffee and think. You think about the different kinds of people you are seeing. You feel the breeze around your arms and back, and you are any age suddenly, are again in that place you were when world was fresh. The different types within that vast continent playing that game last night, that ultimate expression of skill and strength and speed and style. Types or just individuals. That artist harbored photographs of just people. No one thinks themselves a type. Pandemic Park poem. I've always wanted to sit on this bench. Now is the perfect temperature and time. Hardly anyone in the park this Thursday evening. The scent of marijuana being smoked by two gentle souls on a nearby bench wafts over, creating a congenial vibe. Two young women huddled together on the grass, their dinner in a paper bag nearby. They must be sharing something that can't be shared by anyone else. Two squirrels chase each other down a slender trunk in a burst of speed. Are they in love or fighting over food? There's a guy shirtless in shorts on his phone, and someone crashed out on the bench next to him. A trio has spread out a blanket, taken off masks, and is beginning to share their dinner. More people coming in, drizzle starting to fall lightly. Two buildings stand out in the distance. A lot of these poems came from things I was seeing, but also things I was listening to. Dark Star and people I was seeing. A wetness on the ground, puddles, and I can't reach you except through this music, which pulses so long ago, is revived in synapses anyone there or not can transfer across fretboard and key. Sound understated implode, disjunctive schedules, to crawl out of pit, a delicate glance downtown, river nearby, an assurance, light, moments that add up. I assure you intense joy. Riding down the avenue, that building stands low as present reminder, gift in an afternoon. I take the time to write this. Others speak or work around depth, to bottom park in other tongue. Light leaking down fresh, again at the park where that meeting took place. Others still walking, a season past, expression in gait, and resistance to accepting vault, innocuous determinant. Park Avenue South. Such a beautiful cold light. Did I live in that building once? Where was Max's? The back entrances of banks and the Metropolitan Building. Architectural detail Fitzgerald may have passed out on. A little light for Ada. I've got a lamp I'm keeping on for the sanity of this country. Not one cloud today. Bright blue shatter on branches, a fulsome light. Up, but already going down. Shadows stretch these avenues and park facades. Since childhood, with new friendships. Now, car ride here and there to doctor. Later, dark already, light still on. I'll see a writer's family on island. Siren night. Once in a field of flowers. They sit in a field surrounded by daffodils, smiling, looking, tumbling. Ostensibly they are posing, but in effect they are being nature as it affects their being together in this moment of their youth together. In that, they are primal reminders of how we animals are all together in a moment before it gets taken away, or we choose to move from it. But now we feel a vibration from the earth. We are sitting on it. You can see earth, and one is upside down. His head touches earth, waist bridges up. How can everyone be the same age? Their long hair of their time, their jeans and t-shirts, symbols of an age. Uncertainty caught there a moment ago. 43 years, suddenly nothing. That perfect time they are together. Can they gather that? Make something from it? Someone? Take time to be free from it? An air of memories. An air of memories, of garments, decades, guarded against pain, forthcoming at moment, the day holds nothing back. Acropolis. The old flowers wait for us, and the music encompassed in the stones. Marble from Pentelli is the best. It was like an imitation of the sky. The wind up here is terrific. The protagonist is always Athena. The entrance was always in the east. You only get to go around once. Flying back for Vivian. The mountains rise outside the window as the plane whistles and slowly traverses the tarmac. I don't want to leave those mountains. They got inside me somehow, their rocky nature, and the people who grew from that. Lincolnville Motel, 1. 2 overturned wheelbarrows. 2 rakes and a shovel. A panoply of silence. Sun coming up above the tree line, a good, honest cup of coffee, a selection of books for your perusal, and don't forget the LPs. 2, a pure light, a pure haze, and the air is light, a little cooler than yesterday. Crow caws. Sally, the golden lab, says goodbye to me silently. She knows I'm going, knows I'll be back. Sad for a moment, now she bounds up, looking for her ball and Alice, who is outside. Someone comes in for a coffee in a robe. The cars roll by in back of it. Over the Bronx for Gerard. We're heading north over Manhattan, slightly obscured by clouds. We see the Harlem River, then Inwood, which comes archetypally to me in dreams. Now we're heading west, only clouds and the smell of coffee and bananas. The Bronx, where my earliest people came from, is far away. It is not explicable in logical terms. It is not explicable in logical terms, but only in the terms of love, which is not logical. There's a kind of light I want to grasp. There's a kind of light I want to grasp up there above the avenue, and today is their time for love? 2 people walk by hand in hand. A song one loves is in the air. I'll take you to the mat. I'll take you to the mat because I love you. You don't get off that easy. For love. Everybody's looking for love and hopefully finding it. If they do find it, they're probably finding it's difficult to keep or maintain. It keeps shifting, changing what it is. Sonnet for Margaret. Pure purchase on building side, the day of the new moon, time no longer holding me in any place. Walking home last night felt a change. Nothing different, but not the same. Still feeling that days later. All day buildings disappearing into mist. A feeling of calm in their disappearance. Sky still gray another day, but mottling, tending toward that complex hue, bright blue and white. Before the reading, Eddie told me he liked this poem, so I'm going to read it for him. Faces in windows. I want to be alone in this trance of lines. I don't want to reveal too much of myself. I'm alone among these moving images. A tan listening in trees. A tan listening in trees. And now it's dark already, quiet. Debating whether to drive back tonight or in the morning. There is something scary in each proposition. To be far and to come close. To walk streets we walked. There's always some car in my way. There's always some car in my way this sunny day, heading down the river, bombarded by people and streets, the museum, the trees growing, the lower streets taking me closer and closer, my favorite piers where I walked and want to walk again, the tennis courts, and then below, the heart of all my feelings, my wanderings to find something together with someone, bike riders, soccer fields, walks out toward the river. Walk beside you. I want to walk beside you. In this weather, we could just walk anywhere. Start here on this broad sidewalk, then moved to smaller streets. Two clouds. I saw these two clouds, and I wanted to see them with you. They were particular clouds, almost exploding in a bright sky. Now the entire sky is covered, and it is windy and cold. Thank you. Don't ask me any questions. I don't know anything.
First, I just want to say thank you for the beautiful reading. I know from experience that reading involves a giant surge of energy while you perform, and then there's the release. So I am going to talk a little bit for a while you relax. And thanks again, everybody, for coming and for tuning in. I was asked to take part in this event something like a couple months ago. I was actually in Amsterdam when I received the PDF of the book, so I read it at that point in a completely different mindset. And then as we were getting closer, I wanted to read it again, and I had the peculiar experience of I would start, and then I would read a few poems, and then I would have to go back to the start. And I realized what I needed to do was read the book from the back to the front the second time around so that I could see it in a different way and sort of break out a little bit of what I was experiencing. And it's funny because now I've been reading these poems a lot in my head, and suddenly here you are reading them in front of me, and there's another level of experience with it. But I think that ties in well with, hopefully, with what I have to say. So I have a little response here, and this will turn into some questions. And this is a response to reading the whole book, so I am going to touch on a couple things that we didn't hear. But thank you for reading the one I asked you to. Okay. These poems have a patience to them. There's the immediacy and the conveyance of information, the reading or hearing of the poems. Within that, the scale of time is both folded and unfolded per the observation. This is notable especially in the very first line of the first poem, Daffodil. If I imagine all time sequestered in the fold of a daffodil. If I imagine all time sequestered in the fold of a daffodil. The word sequestered jumps out, removed from its usual usage as I hear it, sequestering a jury, but it does carry an intentionality with it. And the line manages to both magnify and encapsulate on a grand scale. And it also offers a wide permission to all the poems that follow, which seems pretty handy, from the writer perspective. There's a lot of reflection of this condition throughout the poems as I read them, not so much on moments as in them. There's usually an observer, though, often from a distance. For instance, Pandemic Park poem locates us at a specific time and place. Now, I didn't know at this time that you had written these poems between 2020 and 2023. I mean, the idea was there, but I was thinking of them as, the entire span of time. So, let's see. It's not so the poem locates us in a specific time and place, not so specific that it dwells on numerical details, dates and times, as some New York school poets we know about have done, but just enough to provide a setting of characters in the park, creating the possibility that this is what it says it is, a pandemic park poem, but it does not have to be happening when we think it is. A lot of these poems drift in and out of this time referentiality, a reminder that what we're doing a lot as humans is attempting to root our identities in sets of perception that are always a moving target. Now, in that poem, for example, somebody has a phone, and that's a very particular kind of event. But The only real pandemic reference in a way is that the trio of people who have masks. And that doesn't, you know, phones aside, that could be talking about the Spanish influenza. You know, it could exist in another time, another place. And there's a strong attention to detail. And I think some of, maybe this was a side effect of removing the artifice from my life, as you mentioned, sort of in the introduction. But I think there's also a way in which these poems have such a nuance that they can kind of float outside of their context. Also, thinking about that poem about the Bronx, you never say in it that you're on a plane. It's clear that you're on a plane. You know, it's clear that you're going over the Bronx, and pretty much that's how you would be doing that. But I really appreciate that there isn't this extra exposition in it. Okay, we're getting closer to a question, but we're not there yet. So there's a feeling of the perpetual present in these poems, the now, as in a poem which you didn't read, but it's the second poem in the book, Pulling Out, which has lines in it, we are leaving behind, we are going forward. And there's this excellent concision, we are leaving behind. There's always something that's supposed to come after the behind, but the behind itself becomes the thing that's, you know, this sense of time. So there's this, and it had me on this idea of the perpetual now. We're always in the perpetual now, and we grow within that. But you know, there's something else. In another instance of time, the poem "A Slight Breeze" opens with a silent afternoon, like 100 years ago. And there's another one, the Meridian, which mentions the mark equinox, which is a reference of the cycle of the Earth wobbling in its axis, which actually takes about 26,000 years, which you say in the poem. Anyway, there's this grand time scale and this feeling of immediacy, and I'm kind of wondering how much intentionality you have in advance. And this sort of leads to a larger question about how you sort of structured the book too. But is this something that you grapple with a lot or think about, or is this something you had a specific intention with in making this collection?
You mean about the structuring of it, the sequencing of it, or which part?
Going back to that line, if I imagine all time sequestered in the fold of a daffodil, is there a particular sense of time that you sort of intended to comment on within the span of these poems, or was it sort of a more natural?
Well, I mean, the poem that you mentioned seems like 100 years ago. What, could you read that again, that bit, or I could read it? But
yeah.
Anyway, that poem is kind of a timelessness that I believe in and I see sometimes, and when I see it, I might try to write a poem that is outside of time. And so in that case, the timelessness was reflected in the silence, which is, as we know from our friend John Cage, is not sound, but it is a kind of sound. And but silence is a very particular kind of sound, and sometimes we do find it out there, surprisingly enough, or maybe, you know, looking into the back behind your apartment or something, as in this case.
Yeah, it was from the poem "A Slight Breeze, a Silent Afternoon," like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
It seemed like such a specific reach in a way, and it, you know, is it true? Sure, it is and it isn't. Is it exactly 100 years ago?
Right.
That probably doesn't matter too much.
It's rhetorical.
It's the sense of it, yeah.
But I feel like I often think about, you know, what's the difference between poetry and fiction? And one of the differences is that fiction is almost always written in the past tense. I mean, that's the tense of the verb that's used. You know, he looked out the window and he saw his best friend, something like that. And poetry can be like that, but when it is like that, it feels like prose to me. So I'm aware of poetry that keeps using the present tense of the verb, or else just dispenses with verbs altogether, you know, or leaves things out, as you were saying, like we are leaving behind. We're leaving something behind, but we're just, the more important thing is noticing that the act of leaving behind in that moment. Like, we're leaving behind. Like, that's heavy to me.
And when you're writing a poem, you can say, we are leaving behind, and stop.
Yeah, exactly.
But when you're writing prose, you have to sort of go on and carry the idea forward.
And no punctuation. I'm kind of like anti-punctuation these days.
Yeah.
I mean, commas are okay, but no periods.
Yeah. Dara, do they feel like a distraction?
Again, they feel a little bit like fiction or prose. They feel like, you know, it doesn't have to be a perfect grammatical, you know, or syntactical sentence. I mean, we've all been through phases where we tried to jettison syntax, normal syntax altogether. I think I have, at least. I'll admit, in this company, Poets Anonymous, that, and I think it's it's a necessary thing to do, and it's also kind of a noble thing to do. It's noble to kind of like fuck with the normal structures of how normal society puts thoughts and sentences together.
Yeah. There was a time in my life where I wanted everything to be connected by a semicolon. It seemed like everything else was, you know, just sort of an extra gesture.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up, I was thinking about the structure of the whole book a little bit, and it's in these 5 sections: A Slight Breeze, Species, Again on the Avenue, Once in a Field, For Love. Each section kind of has a distinct feeling and sort of a movement. As was mentioned in the introduction, there's a certain amount of geographical hopping. And it was interesting, some of it being physical distance and some of it feeling sort of like metaphysical distance. The first few poems are kind of more of a mental space, and then, the section about animals, which I want to ask you more about, but I'm afraid to over-ask about. But I was curious because it's sort of a limited selection, but it's like a very focused point. And at the same time, these poems about animals all sort of focus around encounters with your sons, and such. And then we get to the Again on the Avenue, the New York poem sections, which, you know, strikes me right in the core. And then it opens up again into the field, kind of conjures the poetic field, and For Love being its own emotional geography. And let's see. And within that, so there's geography of memory, a metaphysical geography, these places where you're traveling, even these moments in the Met. In the New York section, there's this poem, Things We Saw at the Met, that's kind of a list of historical items. So I guess my question is sort of, when you make a book like this, is this the kind of book that sort of falls together based on the work that you have, or were you sort of purposefully moving into these different sections?
Well, so in my previous book, something I'm kind of into is like taking note of when I write something and where I wrote it. We probably all do that, but I sometimes like to actually include that information in the book.
Yeah.
So in my previous book, I did do that, and it was by and large maybe completely in chronological order, because I also like that, because I feel like there's a natural progression that I see anyway, even if other people don't see it, that I like. But in this case, I was working with my editor, Deborah Garrison, and she had an idea that we could try to move things around, and I was open to that. So I said, well, okay, let's see what happens. And part of it was the animal poems, which were written during the early pandemic before the vaccine. We went out of town for a while with my parents, and we're living in the country. And so I just started to write poems about animals, which I had never done before, never thought to do before, you know. But it's a genre, right? There's like all the, I think about poetry a lot like that, like epic poetry, lyric poetry, didactic poetry, poems about animals, you know. So it kind of appealed to me as a challenge.
It's a classic form, a classical form.
Yeah, exactly. So I showed them to Deb, and we had this sort of structure of the book, and then I got cold feet. I said, I can't publish poems about animals. That's too crazy, you know. I said, give me those poems.
Yeah.
So we took them out, and then we had some other iterations, and then she was like, no, I think we should, what happened to those animal poems? I said, because I guess I showed her another version. It was like, no animal poems. I said, this is good. I said, I like this book. This book's really cool. And she's like, wait a minute, what about those animal poems?
They're a crowd.
And I was like, okay. So we brought them back, and I said, but I'm not going to publish the poem The Fawn. It's just too emotional and too raw. And I mean, I can't publish a poem about a fawn. I mean, what self-respecting contemporary poet could do that? But she worked on me, and she said, finally she said, you know, people would kill to write a poem like this. And I said, oh, okay. I don't know, I'll just listen to her. She's, you know, I trust her. So there was a lot of trust in this, actually, in the selection there, and also in the sequencing.
Were there more animal poems than the ones you published?
There were a few more, yeah. These were the best ones, though.
Okay. Excellent. No, I mean, I liked that part. And I was thinking briefly of different sort of, you know, obviously Dunn's The Flea comes to mind. You have a tick poem. There's Bishop's Armadillo poem. There, you know, I mean, these are what I remember from my poetic instruction more than other kinds of things in a way. But
But the sections, I like sections sometimes, because I feel like my mind is in sections, not like rigidly compartmentalized, but just like different things I think about. So to just like put everything all together wouldn't really make sense to me. So then it became a nice exercise to see what went where, and there are actually one or two poems that are not from the 20 to 23 phase, like that are earlier, that just sort of snuck in on their own.
I mean, I find that when I'm putting manuscripts together, I tend to lean towards sections. And I mean, I agree that with chronologically, there's just a natural progression of thoughts, whether it's intended or not.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to take their own shape. But I also think it's interesting, there's a way in which, I mean, the poems all feel very grounded. Animals and New York City are very like specific references, and there's a lot of otherwise sort of ethereal, emotional territory. Sometimes, I mean, there are very grounding elements in some of those other poems. There are also animals and insects mentioned in other parts of the book, specifically bee on echinacea in the For Love section.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe the other thing I want to mention, just in terms of book structure, the poems in the last section tend to be shorter, and there are a lot of these two-line poems as well, which is also one of my favorite forms in a way.
Mm-hmm.
You just sort of get in and get out, and what you say is there, you know.
It's a challenge. I think it's really hard to write a short poem.
Yeah.
A very short poem like that.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's like an epigram or something. It's another form.
Yeah. All right. I will. Let's see. Keep going here.
I'll just say that section of the book, well, not For Love, but the one before that, I guess. A lot of those poems I wrote in this practice of just writing every day.
Yeah.
And I think I was actually inspired by my dad, Alex, because he paints every day. And I was like, wow, it's kind of intense to actually just do something every day instead of waiting for inspiration to strike, which is how I usually write poems. I, just get an idea while I'm wandering around.
Yeah.
So I would just have a notebook with me and write whatever was happening, even if it didn't seem interesting at all, and then throw out some and keep some. And those are the ones that a number of the poems at the end of the book, I read some of them where the title and the first line are the same. Like,
Right.
so it's a different idea of a poem also.
Is that very different than your usual practice? Do you tend to write in a specific space, or are you more of a kind of carry a notebook around and wherever the poem happens is where it happens?
Notebook, yeah. No, I'm not. It's funny, like two of my favorite poets, Frank O'Hara and Robert Creeley, wrote in opposite ways, I think, and you could probably tell us more, but O'Hara was famous for writing anywhere, like in the middle of a cocktail party at his loft. He had his typewriter there, and he'd go and start working on a poem. And Creeley, I remember reading, he would be at his party, but then he'd like get an idea for a poem, and he'd go upstairs in his room and type the poem, and then come back to the party. Does that sound accurate? Yeah. So I like a little chaos around me. I can't write if it's too quiet. And so I like to write actually on the street a lot in a notebook usually.
Is this a product of having lived in New York City for a long time?
Yeah, I appreciate New York, and I appreciate like the contingency of it. Like people bump into you, and you see a truck going by. Edmund Berrigan wrote about that. Like the colors painted on the sides of the trucks. So things that you weren't expecting to see that suddenly become important.
I'm glad you mentioned Edwin Denby. All right. Well, as a lifelong New Yorker myself, for the most part, the transition to a section of New York poems sort of stands out and always kind of moves me. And as I was reading them, sometimes I find myself both drawn in and repulsed, as the way a New Yorker would. Like there's the idea of what you love about New York, also the idea that you should get away from it. And sometimes these things are happening at the same time. And I think the poem is called Platform, that mentions garbage men. I have a bunch of friends who are painters who have made paintings of garbage bags, and these paintings always do really well with a New York crowd. There's something about the contemplation of that. But yeah, I'm not sure if this is a reach exactly, but one of the reasons it came to mind is the very first thing I read by you, I read when I was a teenager, and it was in the homage to Ted Berrigan book, which Anne edited. And it was one of my first sort of forays into like a certain kind of information I was trying to find. And so you have a piece in there about going up at, I think it was a Poetry Project marathon, and reading a sentimental poem about Edwin. And when I think of Edwin, I sort of automatically also think of Rudy Burkhart. I think of Yvonne Jacquet. I think of their photos and paintings of buildings and New York City life. Also, when I was at Mr. Katz's retrospective at the Guggenheim a couple years ago, there was a painting of sort of this section of a roof, like the black tar, the red part, and then this sort of haze of New York atmosphere around it. But it reminded me of kind of the way Yvonne Jacquet has these city paintings, the classic photo of Edwin Denby. I think Rudy took that on the rooftops.
Right.
There's some sense for me where this is this very pure, I don't know, pure is probably a terrible word, but it's this sort of quintessential New Yorkness, and it's different than the O'Hara and the sort of Ted Berrigan New York. Partly, and I think of it also partly because I feel like Edwin keeps a certain distance in his sonnets, and I think that you have a similar kind of distance sometimes. It's never that far. When I read these poems, I hear your voice, and I think of you observing things, but you're often not in these poems. So does any of this ring true, and does that kind of,
Yeah, I mean, I try, at least lately, like not to draw attention to myself. Like as I was saying earlier, I had a lot of poems where I did try to draw attention to myself, to the I of the poem. I think a lot of Edwin's poems are like that too. And he, one thing we have in common is we both studied classical literature. I mean, at whatever, high school, university level. And so I think we both got influenced by that. I did, definitely. And I tried, so I had the New York school and also Beat and Black Mountain, like very strong in me when I was a teenager. And I was with Paul and Elio Schneeman, and we were writing a lot of poems together and going to a lot of readings at the Poetry Project. And it was great. It was just like we were surrounded by this amniotic fluid of poetry that was like so nurturing. It was incredible and exciting, So we, but then I felt like, well, I don't want to, like I was writing a little bit too much like Frank O'Hara. Like it was becoming.
Right. One of the pitfalls that many poets experience.
And a lot of people wrote a lot like Ted Berrigan. There were some certain influences were very strong on people. So for me, one of the ways to get away from it a little was to go to classical poetry, ancient Greek and Latin poetry, which is more distance. It's distanced. Even if it is about an individual, in the case of Propertius, just the whole aesthetic is a little bit more about like the form of the poem and these kind of sententiae or ideas, a little bit less so than the frothy surface subject matter.
Right. Okay, I wasn't totally sure if I was going to bring this up, but when I was reading the jacket copy of the book on the PDF I had, the very first thing it says about you is a painterly eye. So in terms of describing New York, say, and thinking about that pandemic park poem too, I think the question is something like how much of conscious versus unconscious kind of observation, when you have these things, is there a kind of a pictorial sense that you're dealing with, or is that sort of removed?
I mean, probably because I've been so steeped in the visual, right? Like I grew up at home with my father, who's a painter, and there were always painters around, and we would see a lot of art, contemporary art that was very exciting and new. So yeah, I think I just internalized that way of looking at things, but also from poetry, James Schuyler's poetry in particular, and other poets, but he in particular is a poet who will paint a picture in his poem very graphically. And he also is a kind of a meditative poet. So he'll be in a place, a physical place, whether it's Long Island or New York City or up in Maine or wherever, and he'll just be seemingly casually describing a scene. And then I've kind of emulated that approach, because in his poems, and also I've found it too, like inevitably something happens.
Right.
And then that becomes the crux of the poem, like in his poem February, which ends with the woman coming into the window. He's just looking at the building, and then this woman comes into the window with a baby. And he describes that. He describes the tulips, and then ends a day like any other.
It occurs to me, one of my own experiences in connecting visual art and poetry was seeing a show of Kurt Schwitter's assemblages at the Pompidou Center in Paris when I was maybe 19 or 20. And I wanted to write a poem like those. And I often think of poetry as having a sculptural quality, not so much, which can be very abstract and can really just be about putting certain words together. I don't know. Is that something that you've ever sort of related to, or do you always think of the poem itself as sort of writerly, or does it ever sort of take these other shapes?
Yeah, I tend to not write poems like according to a method. Let's put it that way. So I also tend to not write ekphrastic poems, because I don't know, it just doesn't appeal to me somehow. I mean, I guess I could write a poem about a painting if it were in a room where other things were happening, you know, and it was part of the situation. But just to like zoom in on a work of art or kind of a methodology, I'm more interested in yeah, like the air and the people and whatever is happening in the moment. That somehow, as I said earlier, is like there's contingency involved and things are always shifting, and that I think gets to what you were referring to earlier about time, like being, I think you said, in the now or like the present, is because of this shifting quality of things. That, and I like to try to write about that. So I don't really write like that. But I wanted, just on the question of time, I just wanted to mention in the poem, In a Field of Flowers, is actually written about a photograph. So it's written about the past. It refers to the past 43 years ago. But I use the present tense in the poem. I don't use the past tense. So I try to make the scene that's depicted in the photograph be in the present, even then, when it's about the past.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt this conversation about time, but I just want to make sure we have enough time for questions of the audience.
Okay.
How do you feel?
I'll just wrap it up, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Okay. My only other thought about this sort of visual art bent is that you do. This is an observation. One of these poems is called "There Was an Incredible Light Yesterday," and I do feel like you have a certain response to light that happens throughout these poems, which does feel to me like very much a kind of artistic consideration in a certain way. And I love this poem. It just sort of, and it goes on to describe the sky and the clouds and you know, along the lines of what you were saying, it kind of takes it in this other direction. Okay, the last thing I really wanted to ask about was just these poems were written in a specific crazy time, and now we're in the sequel to that crazy time, and everything's gone up like another notch. And as you mentioned removing the artifice from my life for that particular set of poems. The first time I read them through, to me I felt like there was a stunning lack of violence, which I was really happy about. And then, you know, as I read them through again later, there are these little instances, specifically the poem, the one for Ada, which I have written out here, typed out here. It's basically having here we go. The poem "A Little Light for Ada" begins, "I've got a lamp I'm keeping on for the sanity of this country." There's also this other reference in the poem "Species." The young women have to take the place of their mothers early, before their time, but somehow they do it as they do everything, non-violently. And two other little notes along those lines. May poem ends with the line, "It's not about buying, but rather about feeling the air." And my other, not really violent, but one of my favorite moments in the title poem is, "My door is open to the revenge of snow." So it seems like there was a conscious effort not to include some of this stuff. And I just find the contrast really strong, because so much negative information and energy is projected now through all the forms of media. So it's really interesting to me to read this book, and it just doesn't have that stuff in the same way. It alludes to it here and there.
I wrote a book back when George W. Bush was president, and he nominated John Roberts to the Supreme Court, and I knew he was going to get approved. So I decided to write a poem. I was very frustrated then and feeling very impotent about the whole situation. So I decided to write a poem that was completely composed of words from the New York Times, but shifted around and reconfigured. So there's that approach, but I kind of like this approach now better, which is seeing more of the eternal, airy aspect of our existence and not focusing on, like, I don't want to just be repeating what I'm reading in the newspaper.
Right, exactly, or getting trapped in the...
It's very difficult to write about current events. I mean, Allen Ginsberg was a master and does it beautifully, but if you try to do it, it's almost impossible, honestly, without coming off like you're just the newspaper.
Yeah, no, and I do miss Alan's political points of view, as I have since 1997, basically, every time some new strange event happens.
Yeah.
Okay, was there anything that you wanted to touch on yourself before we open it up?
No, I think we could see if anyone would like to say anything
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience?
or comments.
Well, I have a comment, is that it's a nice length of reading,
Hmm.
so really I was able to sink into it.
Hmm.
And I love your tone, it's so dry,
Hmm.
and I don't know if it's because I know you and it's like coming off that way,
Mm-hmm.
or yeah, it seems like so steely and
Hmm.
level and stark,
Hmm.
very stark.
No, I appreciate
And
that.
I really like that quality very much.
Oh,
It's
thank you.
no emotion there.
Well, it's not emotional, but
Yeah.
I think there's emotion.
Right.
Maybe it's a little suppressed, not repressed, but suppressed. It's like a little bit below the surface.
Well, I think it's because that's how you can see it. You see it actually,
Hmm.
because once you start adding emotionals into it, then it gets perverted.
Mm-hmm.
But you're delivering it like in, well, I know it maybe not pure,
Mhm.
but more like how it really is,
Hmm.
without any layers, like head. There's no head space, but there's a lot of space.
I was thinking of it as
Makes sense.
patience.
Hmm.
As I was reading it. There's a lot of patience in these poems. The only time there's even a hint of impatience is there's always some car in my way.
Oh, right.
Which I resemble that remark, but no, I mean, that was something else that I really appreciated within that. There's space, there's room to process. It's not a mad dash. Go ahead.
I wondered if you were being kind of particularly calm and level in calling it a water bug. I mean, versus a cockroach. Like with that.
The water bugs are bigger. They're like that.
They're the big
Oh,
ones.
I don't know. I guess I've had debates with friends, and they said it's just a roach. And
And I think of roaches are little like cute things.
really, well, I guess I'm from Australia where a roach is that big
Oh.
Yeah.
thing
Okay.
that comes out and everybody like freaks out.
Well, I think we call them water bugs.
Right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
To Australian, that seems like a very kind, gentle way. It's like calling it a squirrel. And
I'm trying to be empathetic to the water bug
you're
and their
Well,
existence.
They are another life form.
Yeah, they
I
are.
mean, and all life is precious.
It is.
I wondered if Pizza Rat was going to make an appearance.
Maybe. You never know.
Does anyone else have any comments, questions? Great. All right.
Thank you very much. Please come up and meet Vincent and Eddie, and I'm sure you'll be able to sign books. You'll be
Yeah,
happy
yeah,
to
of
sign
course.
books.